It was on a cold and heavy April evening in the year 1745 that Versailles became the stage for a scandal whispered through every gilded corridor. In the glow of 1,000 candles, as courtiers turned their eyes toward the King of France, there appeared beside him a woman unknown to their noble bloodlines, a woman born not into privilege but into the bustling streets of Paris. She would be remembered as Madame de Pompadour, mistress, advisor, and companion of Louis the Well-Beloved, whose reign she would quietly steer, not from a throne, but from the intimacy of his heart. Before we begin, dear listener, I greet you as a fellow traveler in time. Tell me, where do you rest as you listen? Beneath the stars of one land, or the lamplight of another? Share it, if you wish, in the circle of comments, and join others scattered across the world, all gathered here as if around a single fire. And if you find warmth in these nightly chronicles, remember to touch the subscribe button so that these stories may continue to reach you and those who come after. The tale begins far from the glittering palace, in the narrow, fragrant streets of Paris, where merchants cried out their wares, and the smell of bread and roasting chestnuts mingled with damp stone. It was here, in December of 1721, that Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson was born, a child of modest circumstances and uncertain fortune. Her father, François Poisson, dealt in finance and speculation, ventures that carried as much peril as promise. Her mother, Madeleine de la Motte, carried the sharpness of ambition in her voice and the quiet force of determination in her eyes. Into their arms came this infant, with little to mark her as extraordinary, save for the whisper that clung to her cradle. It was said by a fortune-teller visited in a moment of curiosity that the girl was destined one day to rule the heart of a king. How easily such prophecies are spoken, how lightly they float upon the air. Yet sometimes they cling like burrs to the fabric of a life, guiding choices and dreams that might otherwise have drifted elsewhere. In those first years, the family's fortune wavered like a candle flame in a draught. François Poisson became entangled in financial dealings that led him to flee abroad to avoid charges of fraud. The weight of respectability fell upon Madeleine, who bore it with determination. She devoted herself to shaping Jeanne-Antoinette into a being of refinement, not through wealth, but through careful schooling. Tutors were engaged, lessons in manners and literature, in singing and the harpsichord, in the steps of courtly dance. A child's laughter mingled with the disciplined repetition of French verses, while outside the city's noise pressed in, a reminder of the chasm between their station and the splendor of Versailles. Was it maternal love or the echo of prophecy that drove Madeleine to such effort? Perhaps both. For in the story of Pompadour, one cannot easily separate belief from ambition, chance from design. The little girl, with her dark hair and luminous eyes, became skilled not only in recitation but in conversation, a subtle art that would carry her further than music or needlework. She learned to listen, to tilt her head just so, to let her eyes shine with interest, to offer replies both clever and gentle. It was not mere charm, but the weaving of an invisible net that drew others toward her. Even as a child, she seemed aware of the effect and of the doors it might open. The Poisson household, though without noble title, had access to certain salons of Paris, those drawing rooms where philosophy and wit sparkled as brightly as crystal chandeliers. It was here that Jeanne-Antoinette's presence began to be felt, a girl of tender years, sitting quietly in the corner, absorbing the debates of thinkers and the jests of playwrights. Words became her companions, ideas her secret treasures. She saw how a single phrase, well placed, could shift a conversation, could alter the course of another's esteem. In such gatherings, the seeds of her later influence were sown. There was, too, a gentler side to her training. Walks through gardens, lessons in the delicate appreciation of flowers, in the arrangement of colors and shapes. This sensitivity to beauty would remain with her, shaping not only her taste in decoration but her very sense of self. Beauty was not a frivolous ornament. It was a form of order, of meaning. And perhaps, deep within, she sensed that to be surrounded by beauty was to resist the chaos of the world, the uncertainties of fortune and favor. In the winter evenings when the city was hushed beneath snow, Jeanne-Antoinette would sit by the fire and listen to her mother speak of destiny. The fortune-teller's words returned like a refrain. "One day you will be beloved of a king." The child's imagination drifted toward the shining halls of Versailles, that distant world of silks and jewels, of rituals performed with hushed reverence. Did she believe it fully? Did she dream of it nightly? Or was it more her mother's belief, woven into the very fabric of her upbringing, until it became impossible to tell where desire ended and fate began? As she grew, others began to notice her grace. Visitors remarked upon her composure, her luminous skin, the intelligence in her glance. Such qualities did not guarantee fortune, yet they attracted the attention of those who might open doors. One cannot say if Jeanne-Antoinette felt herself being shaped, or if she herself chose the shaping. The line is faint, blurred as candlelight on glass, but the direction was clear, upward, always upward, toward a realm where few of her birth might ever tread. Paris in the 1720s and 1730s was a city of contrasts. The grandeur of the Palais Royal stood not far from alleys where beggars huddled. Carriages rolled over cobblestones, past market stalls, steaming with fish and fowl. The perfume of roses and jasmine floated from gardens enclosed within high walls, while outside the air reeked of tannery vats. This was the city Jeanne-Antoinette knew, both its elegance and its hardship. To walk its streets was to learn that beauty and squalor exist side by side, and that one may slip from one to the other with startling speed. Perhaps this awareness lent her the prudence she would later display, the knowledge that fortune is not fixed, but precarious. There is a story told that as a young girl she would be driven in a small carriage by her mother to the very gates of Versailles to watch the king pass during his hunts. Her eyes would follow the procession with a mixture of wonder and determination. Imagine her there, a child with her hands clasped, peering through the iron bars at a world that seemed as unreachable as the moon. Did she feel the stirring of destiny, or merely the ache of longing? We cannot know, but the image lingers. A girl outside the gates, gazing inward, the echo of prophecy in her ears. Time moves quietly in childhood, yet suddenly one looks and finds the child grown. Jeanne-Antoinette became a young woman, her features ripened into beauty, her manners polished to a sheen. Suitors began to circle, measuring both her charms and her prospects. For though her family lacked noble blood, they carried connections among financiers, and such connections could be useful to ambitious men. Her mother, ever watchful, considered carefully. To marry her daughter well was to anchor her against misfortune, and perhaps to place her upon a path that might yet lead toward the prophecy's fulfillment. And so the stage of her early life is set. A child of Paris, raised in the shadow of a scandalized father, shaped by an ambitious mother, trained in the arts of wit and beauty, gazing always toward the distant palace whose gates she once peered through. The music of her future was faint but persistent, a melody heard only in fragments. And as the lamps of Paris flickered against the night, the girl who would become Madame de Pompadour dreamed not of modest comforts, but of something greater, though what shape it might take remained veiled in time. The image of her remains unresolved, a little girl standing at the threshold of destiny, gazing toward a world yet to know her name. And as the snow fell quietly on the cobblestones, the sound of distant hoofbeats lingered in her ears, carrying her imagination toward the unseen king. The hoofbeats faded into silence, and from that hush another sound arose, the murmur of voices carried across polished wooden floors, the clink of glasses filled with wine, the warm vibration of laughter breaking through the solemn air of Parisian salons. For Jeanne-Antoinette, now a young woman, these gatherings became her true schooling, for here one learned not only to repeat lessons, but to weave thought into charm, and charm into influence. The salons were chambers of light in a city still heavy with shadows, candles multiplied in mirrored sconces, casting an illusion of endless brightness, while tapestries softened the echoes of words that might otherwise have scattered into the air. The company was mixed. Philosophers with ink-stained fingers, financiers with measured glances, artists carrying the scent of paint upon their clothes, noblemen balancing wit with dignity. Into these circles Jeanne-Antoinette was introduced, seated often at the edge, at first silent, but her silence was not empty. She listened, she measured, she studied how each phrase could elevate or diminish, how admiration was a currency more subtle than gold. Her mother guided her carefully, for Madeleine de la Motte believed that a woman must be trained not only in beauty, but in intellect. What good would it be to possess a charming face if the mind behind it were unready to grasp opportunity? Thus the tutors drilled her in literature, in history, in the polish of verse, until her memory sparkled with lines that could be summoned like jewels at the right moment. She recited Racine and Corneille, not as lessons, but as if they were her own thoughts, offered in the flow of conversation. When she laughed, it was never too loud. When she spoke, it was never too long. Listeners found themselves leaning closer, waiting for her words. In these circles she encountered the hum of Enlightenment ideas, though not always named as such, questions about reason, progress, tolerance, the power of the mind to shape the world. She did not argue like a scholar. Instead, she reflected these ideas back with gentleness, as if holding them in her hands and showing them to others in a clearer light. Was it calculation, or was it her natural gift? That question would linger throughout her life. To some, she seemed the embodiment of genuine curiosity. To others, a woman carefully fashioned for assent. Perhaps she herself could no longer distinguish between the two. It is said that a fortune-teller once reaffirmed the prophecy, declaring to Madeleine that her daughter was destined to capture the king's heart. Whether true or embroidered by memory, this belief infused every step of her upbringing. And so, as Jeanne-Antoinette grew more admired in salons, her mother whispered reminders of destiny. Each compliment she received, each gaze that lingered upon her, became a small step on a staircase that might, one day, lead toward Versailles. Did the young woman believe it fully, or did she walk half in skepticism, half in dream? Destiny can be both a burden and a lantern, leading us forward yet leaving us unsure whether the light comes from beyond or from within ourselves. At 20, Jeanne-Antoinette was striking in beauty and poise. Her features bore delicacy without fragility. Her eyes radiated an intelligence that seemed to invite confidences. Suitors began to appear, drawn not only to her charm, but to the possibility of alliance with her family's financial ties. Among them was Charles Guillaume Lenormand d'Étiolles, nephew of a wealthy financier. His fortune and respectability offered stability. In 1741, they married, and Jeanne-Antoinette moved into a comfortable estate at Étiolles, near the forest of Senart. Here, life might have settled into ease. The estate offered gardens, wide rooms, gentle seclusion. Yet Jeanne-Antoinette's nature was not content with stillness. She began to gather thinkers and artists, creating her own salon, a smaller mirror of the great gatherings of Paris. Writers recited drafts of plays, musicians played newly written sonatas, philosophers shared the glimmer of ideas still half-formed. She, the hostess, moved with quiet elegance among them, binding together voices and egos with her presence. These evenings were not merely diversions, they were rehearsals. For here she practiced the art of bringing people together, of guiding conversation, of making each guest feel valued. The world of Versailles still seemed distant, but in her gatherings she created her own Versailles, ruled not by birthright, but by talent. There are accounts that Louis XV hunting near the forest of Sénart, first glimpsed her along those wooded paths. She would drive her carriage with daring speed, daring enough to draw attention. Some say she timed her rides to catch the king's notice, others that chance played its role. Which is truth? Perhaps both, for ambition often waits patiently upon chance, ready to seize it when it passes by. And so, in the rustle of leaves and the echo of hooves, the threads of their destinies began to entwine, though faintly, not yet knotted. But before Versailles, there was Paris, and in Paris the young Madame d'Étiole, she who would be Pompadour, continued to refine herself. She studied engraving, she sang, she danced, she practiced acting. Every art became part of her armor, each skill another jewel in her crown of self-fashioning. If one is to step into a world that judges with merciless eyes, must one not prepare every gesture, every glance? And yet, even as she prepared, there was still within her a warmth that charmed beyond calculation, a sense that she truly delighted in the arts, that she was nourished by music and poetry as much as by ambition. Imagine her in those years, a young woman standing in a salon, light falling on her gown, her hand resting lightly on a harpsichord as a guest plays, her laughter rising like a silver thread above the murmur of conversation. Behind her, windows open onto gardens where night air drifts in. Around her, men of letters and financiers argue and jest, but it is she who holds their attention, not by dominance, but by grace. Did she sense that all this was a prelude, a preparation for something greater? Did she ever tire of the weight of prophecy, or did it thrill her? Paris itself was her teacher. Its rhythm, its contrasts, its voices in the marketplace, its elegance in the boulevards, all shaped her. She learned that life is a theater of appearances, and that survival depends not on truth alone, but on the mask one chooses to wear. Yet beneath the mask must lie a core strong enough to endure the envy, the malice, the suspicion that rise wherever beauty and ambition meet. Already whispers followed her, admiration tinged with envy, comments upon her readiness for higher places, and always, beyond the horizon of these whispers, the distant glow of Versailles shimmered like a mirage. Her husband may have hoped for contentment, for a peaceful domesticity, but Jeanne-Antoinette's path would not rest so easily. She bore a daughter, Alexandrine, yet the child's presence did not anchor her to the quiet rhythms of estate life. Her gaze lifted still toward the palace, the prophecy alive in her veins. Was it love she sought, or power, or the strange intertwining of both? We cannot know. But as evenings lengthened and conversations lingered into the night, her name began to circulate beyond her own circle, until it drifted toward those who whispered close to the king. And so the image remains, unresolved at the close of this chapter. A young woman standing at the threshold of her destiny, laughter echoing in salons, eyes lifted toward a vision only she and her mother seemed to truly believe. Outside, the night presses against the windows, and in the distance, through the forest, the sound of hounds and horns begins to rise again, calling her toward a fate that waits within the gilded halls. The horns of the hunt rose in the forest, mingling with the baying of hounds and the thundering of hooves, and from this sound the course of her destiny would at last begin to take shape. Jeanne-Antoinette, now in her early 20s, would drive her carriage along the wooded paths of Sénart with a daring spirit, her wheels rattling across the uneven ground, the horses urged forward as if the air itself carried a secret challenge. It was said she timed these excursions to coincide with the royal hunts, and whether by chance or design, her figure soon drew the notice of the king. Louis XV, weary of solemn duties and dulled by the repetition of courtly life, lifted his gaze toward this vision of grace and boldness amidst the trees. Some whisper that she turned her head and met his glance without hesitation, as though she recognized the moment foretold to her mother so long ago. Others say it was the king who watched silently, curiosity stirred by the elegance of one whose name he did not yet know. Which tale is true, and which is embroidery of later years, we cannot tell. Yet it is from such whispers that legends take their root. The hunt was the king's great passion, the one pursuit that roused his spirit beyond the confines of duty. It was among the clamor of horns, the scent of earth and horse sweat, the thrill of the chase, that his heart seemed most alive. To intrude upon this sacred realm was no small feat, for the king guarded it as jealously as his throne. Yet Jeanne-Antoinette, seated upright in her carriage, adorned in garments chosen with both elegance and restraint, succeeded where others might have faded into the crowd. She became a figure the king remembered, a presence that lingered in his mind long after the hounds had been called back and the silence of Versailles returned. Not long after, invitations began to stir. Connections within the world of finance and nobility, carefully nurtured through years of her mother's determination, were drawn upon. Jeanne-Antoinette was presented at gatherings where the king might be present, and there she unfolded her talents with a gentle hand. She did not rush forward nor overwhelm with boldness. Instead, she offered laughter at the right moment, a word of comfort when weariness shadowed the king's brow, a delicate understanding that seemed to anticipate his moods before he himself had named them. In such small gestures, influence takes root more deeply than in declarations of devotion. Louis XV was, at this time, a man both powerful and adrift. Known as the well-beloved, he had inherited a kingdom radiant in wealth and culture, yet beneath the surface, discontent simmered. His own spirit wavered between duty and desire, often turning from the burdens of state toward diversions that dulled his restlessness. Jeanne-Antoinette offered not only beauty, but a companionship unlike that of fleeting courtly affairs. She listened with patience. She responded with wit. She carried the air of one who belonged in his presence, not by accident, but by some deeper harmony. The prophecy was unfolding, though whether by fate or by careful preparation remained a question for those who watched. The court, of course, did not receive her kindly. The nobles who had been raised in the certainty of their superiority bristled at the presence of a bourgeois woman ascending into the king's affections. Their whispers filled the corridors, words of disdain disguised as amusement, envy hidden behind polite smiles. Yet Jeanne-Antoinette carried herself with serenity, as if the sting of such barbs could not pierce the calm armor of her composure. Perhaps she knew already that scandal was inevitable, that to walk beside a king without noble birth was to invite the scorn of those who believed power to be their inheritance alone. Her husband, Charles Guillaume d'Étiolles, found himself cast aside by the unfolding drama. Though their marriage had brought respectability and comfort, it could not compete with the call of destiny. Jeanne-Antoinette parted from him, her path diverging into one that would lift her far above the life he had imagined. In this, too, she demonstrated a strength of will, for to leave the security of marriage for the uncertainty of the king's favor was a step many would have feared. Yet she stepped forward, guided by the unseen hand of fate, or by her own unwavering belief in the prophecy. It was in 1745 that she was formally presented to the court, no longer merely Jeanne-Antoinette d'Étiolles, but now granted the title Marquise de Pompadour. The transformation was complete, a new name, a new identity, a new role upon the stage of Versailles. The presentation itself was a spectacle of formality. Every bow and curtsy measured, every eye upon her as she entered the halls glittering with gold. Imagine her heart in that moment. The echo of her childhood carriage rides to the palace gates, now fulfilled as she stepped within them at last. The murmur of courtiers rose like the rustling of leaves in a storm, yet she walked with composure, as if she had always belonged. What thoughts passed through the king's mind as he watched her, we cannot know. Perhaps he saw only beauty. Perhaps he sensed in her a refuge from the weariness that often overcame him. Perhaps he recognized in her an intelligence that could steady his faltering spirit. Or perhaps he saw all these at once, bound together in a presence that promised not merely diversion but companionship. For Louis XV was a man often accused of indifference, yet in Jeanne-Antoinette he seemed to find a spark that roused him anew. Thus the prophecy of her childhood was fulfilled, at least in the eyes of those who believed it. The little girl once gazing through the gates of Versailles had entered within, not as a guest, but as a figure whose place was beside the king himself. Yet prophecy fulfilled is not prophecy completed, for the path that stretched before her would demand resilience greater than any fortune-teller could have imagined. Already the venom of scandal gathered in whispers. Already the eyes of rivals sought her downfall. To remain in favor, to wield influence not merely as mistress, but as advisor, required a strength both subtle and unyielding. As night fell over Versailles and the candles burned low, Jeanne-Antoinette sat within her new apartments, hearing faintly through the open window the distant echo of horns in the forest, as though they called to her still, reminding her of the chase that had brought her here. But the hunt was no longer of deer or boar. It was of power, of influence, of survival within a court that welcomed her with smiles, yet plotted with daggers of words. And she, seated beneath the painted ceilings, must prepare to play her part upon this vast and glittering stage. The image lingers, the horns fading into silence, the glow of candles upon gilded mirrors, a woman seated with calm determination, the murmur of scandal already rising beyond her doors. The candlelight trembled in the mirrors of her chamber, and beyond the closed doors the whispers of scandal wound their way like smoke through the corridors of Versailles. Jeanne-Antoinette had been named Marquise de Pompadour, and in that moment she was no longer merely a guest upon the stage of history, but its principal figure, poised beneath the unblinking gaze of all who sought to judge her. To be the mistress en titre, the official favorite of the king, was to carry a title at once dazzling and dangerous, for it promised a crown of influence, yet balanced it upon a blade. Every step, every word, every gesture from this night onward was magnified, recorded in glances, repeated in murmurs, embroidered in gossip until truth and invention became indistinguishable. The court itself was a theater in perpetual performance. Etiquette dictated not only the order of meals, but the angle of a bow, the length of a smile, the very tone of a sigh. And within this theater, where every noble bore centuries of lineage like armor, Jeanne-Antoinette's presence was an affront. She was of bourgeois birth, the daughter of a financier whose reputation had been shadowed by scandal. Her refinement had been cultivated by diligence, not inherited by blood. To the old nobility, this was intolerable. How could the king elevate such a woman to the place where noble daughters had vied and failed? Yet it was precisely this break from tradition that made her so striking, for Louis XV, so often dulled by routine, seemed awakened by the novelty of her presence. She entered Versailles not as a timid intruder, but as one who had studied its ways with devotion. She dressed with exquisite care, choosing colors that flattered without gaudiness, arranging her hair in styles that whispered of elegance without drowning in extravagance. She greeted courtiers with deference, yet carried herself with a dignity that did not crumble before their disdain. This delicate balance, humility without abasement, confidence without arrogance, was her shield. Slowly, grudgingly, some began to acknowledge that her grace could not be denied. The king himself, in her company, appeared softened. Those who had known him as distant, withdrawn, found him animated when she was near. She spoke to him not only of pleasures, but of matters beyond the boudoir. She drew his attention to plays, to books, to discussions of philosophy that sparked beneath the surface of Enlightenment thought. In her presence, he was not merely the monarch weighed by the crown, but a man allowed to be curious, to be moved by art and word. Perhaps this was her greatest gift, to remind the king of his humanity. And yet, what irony! that this gift became the source of suspicion, for the nobles whispered that she sought to rule him, to bend his will, to shape the kingdom according to her designs. The role of Mistress en titre was not solely one of affection. It carried political weight, for access to the king meant access to power. Petitioners crowded toward her, hoping that through her words their causes might reach royal ears. She became the conduit through which ambition flowed, and with each petition she granted or denied, she gained not only gratitude but enmity. To hold such a position was to walk upon a narrow path where every step might lead to triumph or ruin. In those early months, her apartments within the palace became both sanctuary and prison. Their walls glittered with tapestries, their ceilings painted with mythologies of gods and lovers. Yet outside, those doors lay an ocean of hostility. Some courtiers refused to speak to her. Others offered false smiles laced with contempt. Pamphlets circulated in Paris, mocking her origins, inventing scandals, portraying her as a manipulator. But Jeanne-Antoinette endured, her composure rarely faltering. Perhaps she remembered her childhood lessons, the fortune-teller's words, the image of her mother's determined eyes. To falter now would be to betray not only herself, but the prophecy that had shaped her life. Louis, too, showed his resolve. He attended her with a devotion that silenced, for a time, the sharpest tongues. He granted her privileges, titles, estates. He allowed her to preside at entertainments, to stand by his side at public occasions. This elevation was more than scandal. It was transformation, for she was no longer a shadow whispering behind the scenes, but a visible presence in the ceremonial life of the monarchy. The court might bristle, but the king's will was sovereign, and so the Marquise de Pompadour stood radiant among them, proof that birth could be eclipsed by charm, that destiny could be fashioned from ambition. Yet beneath the surface of this triumph lay solitude, for though she held the king's heart, she was surrounded by suspicion. Friends were few, true allies rarer still. She found solace in the arts, in music and theater, in the company of thinkers who valued her mind rather than her station. It was here that her role as patron began, though at first it was no more than evenings of performance in her apartments, gatherings where actors recited verses and musicians played sonatas. To her, art was both refuge and declaration, a way to assert her place not merely through the king's favor, but through the cultivation of beauty. One wonders what she felt in the quiet of night, when the candles guttered low and the palace at last fell silent. Did she hear the echo of the whispers? Did they creep into her dreams? Did she question the path that had brought her here, the sacrifice of her marriage, the exposure to envy? Or did she rest secure in the belief that she was fulfilling a destiny larger than herself? History cannot answer, yet the image of her in those hours lingers, a woman seated before her mirror, unpinned jewels glinting faintly as she lets down her hair, her gaze steady, unflinching, though perhaps shadowed by thoughts unspoken. Versailles itself seemed to absorb her presence. The gilded halls, accustomed to centuries of noble lineage, now reflected the light of one born outside their circle. The very air vibrated with the tension she embodied, the clash between tradition and novelty, between birthright and talent. To some, she was a herald of decay, proof that the monarchy was corrupted by indulgence. To others, she was a symbol of vitality, breathing new life into a court grown stagnant. And to Louis XIII, she was simply indispensable, the companion whose presence soothed the restlessness that gnawed at him. Thus the first chapter of her reign at Versailles closed. Jeanne-Antoinette, now Madame de Pompadour, established as the king's mistress, surrounded by both splendor and hostility, admired and despised in equal measure. She had crossed the threshold, stepped fully into the role fate or ambition had carved for her. The path ahead would demand not only beauty and wit, but endurance, for the trials of power had only begun. And so the scene dissolves. the rustle of silk along marble floors, the murmurs of courtiers fading into the distance, the glow of candlelight dimming into shadow. At the heart of Versailles sits a woman of unshaken composure, listening beyond the walls to the faint sigh of the wind that carries with it both promise and peril. The sigh of the wind pressed against the palace walls, and with it came the murmur of voices that never truly slept. Versailles was alive with whispers, echoing from gallery to gallery, gliding through silk curtains, carried in the low tones of courtiers who pretended at indifference, but drank greedily from the cup of gossip. Madame de Pompadour, Mistress antique, now moved among them with poise, yet behind her graceful bow and serene smile rose a storm of envy. The nobility, who guarded their birthright with fierceness, saw in her a challenge not only to their pride, but to the order of a world where titles were meant to be inherited, not bestowed. At suppers and receptions, where music floated in the air and chandeliers glittered, courtiers would offer her compliments, then turn away to exchange glances of disdain. "The daughter of a financier," some sneered, "daring to wear jewels reserved for princesses." Others laughed behind fans, mocking her careful gestures, her studied elegance, as though refinement learned through effort could never equal the ease of noble blood. Yet the more they mocked, the more they watched her, unable to resist the magnet of her presence. For scandal, like fire, draws eyes even as it consumes. Pamphlets circulated in Paris written by hands both anonymous and eager, depicting her as a manipulator, a temptress whose ambition threatened the very heart of France. She was accused of controlling the king, of whispering into his ear while ministers bowed in frustration. They called her extravagant, though she was careful with her household. They painted her as vulgar, though her manners were precise. It was not truth they sought, but the satisfaction of wounding. For in the rise of Madame de Pompadour, they saw a mirror reflecting their own weakness. That power at court was no longer theirs by right, but could be seized by a woman of intelligence and grace. And yet, even amidst this storm, Jeanne-Antoinette stood unyielding. She walked the halls of Versailles with composure, her step measured, her eyes serene, as if the whispering did not reach her ears. When she passed, courtiers bowed reluctantly, their gestures practiced yet stiff, but she returned each with dignity. It is said she practiced patience, like an art, for she knew that scandal was fleeting, but influence once rooted could endure. Was it faith in her destiny that gave her such calm, or was it the resilience of one who had grown among the unpredictability of Paris, where fortunes rose and fell overnight? Perhaps both, bound together into a strength that surprised even herself. The king's devotion protected her in these early years. Louis XV, so often portrayed as indifferent, revealed through her a steadiness few expected. He defended her against slander, granted her privileges, honored her at public ceremonies. His presence at her side silenced the sharpest tongues, for none could openly scorn the woman whom the king himself cherished. This devotion was not mere indulgence. She gave him more than distraction. In her company, he found conversation that enlivened him, amusements that softened the burden of reign, and companionship that was neither fleeting nor shallow. Thus the storm of envy raged, yet its winds could not easily tear her from his side. Still, the toll was heavy. To be both adored and despised is a weight difficult to bear. At night, in the quiet of her apartments, when the murmur of voices beyond her walls faded, she would sit by the fire and feel the solitude of her position. For who among the courtiers could she trust? Allies shifted with the wind. Flatterers waited only for a chance to betray. Her solace was found in letters, in books, in music. She read plays and poetry, rehearsed lines aloud, found refuge in the harmony of words that belonged to a world beyond scandal. Perhaps she understood that art is not merely decoration but sustenance, a thread connecting the fragile present to the eternal. The nobles who hated her may not have realized that in their hostility they sharpened her resolve. Each slight, each whisper became fuel for her determination to endure, for she knew that her place at Versailles was not secured by beauty alone, but by her ability to outlast the storm. And thus she did not retreat, did not falter. Instead, she cultivated patience, allowing time to soften resentment, allowing her own deeds to speak more loudly than accusations. The court watched her closely, waiting for missteps. But what they saw instead was a woman who carried herself with composure, in triumph and humility in favor. They could not understand how one of such birth could possess such poise, and so they called it manipulation, ambition, deceit. Yet perhaps it was something simpler, the strength of a woman who had lived her life beneath the shadow of prophecy, who had learned to believe that she was shaped for a destiny beyond the ordinary. In the corridors of Versailles, where mirrors reflected not only images but illusions, Jeanne-Antoinette's figure became a symbol. To some, she embodied scandal, to others, transformation. The court divided itself around her, and Paris, too, echoed with debate. Was she an enchantress corrupting the king, or a refined companion elevating him above the dullness of routine? The truth lay somewhere in between, elusive as candlelight. But truth mattered less than perception, and perception was shaped by whispers. Thus ended the first full season of her presence at Versailles. She was established, undeniable yet contested on all sides. The salons of Paris buzzed with her name, the pamphlets multiplied, the courtiers schemed. But through it all she remained, serene at the king's side, unshaken in her composure. She had entered the storm and was still standing, though the wind had not yet ceased to howl. The image lingers, a woman walking through the hall of mirrors, her reflection multiplied endlessly, each one watched with suspicion, each one whispered about, yet each one unbroken. Outside the palace the night deepened, and in the distance a single candle burned low, its flame wavering but refusing to go out. The candle burned low, its flame bending in the draught, trembling yet refusing to be extinguished, and in that fragile light another transformation unfolded. Jeanne-Antoinette was no longer the young woman from Paris, no longer the wife whose name was tied to an estate near Sénart. She was now Madame de Pompadour, the king's chosen mistress, the marquise whose identity had been remade in gold and silk. With the title came more than privilege. It carried the weight of expectation, of scrutiny, of a new self she must inhabit fully if she were to survive in this glittering labyrinth of Versailles. Clothing became her armor. She dressed not merely to please but to declare her presence. Her gowns shimmered with hues that caught the eye, yet never descended into gaudiness, for she knew excess would only feed her enemies' mockery. Jewels sparkled at her throat and wrists, yet she arranged them with restraint, as though to remind the court that beauty could be a discipline as much as a display. Each morning she faced her mirror as if facing a battlefield, her hair styled with precision, her features softened by rouge and powder, her posture rehearsed until it carried the dignity of one who belonged. To be Madame de Pompadour was to live within a costume, a role that demanded constant vigilance. Her apartments, newly furnished, glowed with tapestries and carved wood, perfumed by flowers carefully arranged. Here she received guests, entertained the king, and cultivated an atmosphere that balanced warmth with refinement. Yet even these chambers, adorned as they were, could feel like a gilded cage. Beyond their walls stretched corridors, heavy with envy, eyes waiting for her misstep, lips eager to twist her words. Inside she held dominion, outside she was surrounded by hostility. Such was the paradox of her new life, crowned with splendor, yet isolated in its brilliance. She bore this solitude with quiet resilience. She wrote letters, practiced music, studied plays. She trained herself in the language of politics, listening to ministers, asking questions that revealed a keen mind. She read histories of France, works of philosophy, even treatises on finance, seeking to understand the machinery of the realm. For though she had risen through affection, she intended to endure through intellect. It was not enough to be beautiful. Beauty fades in the eyes of those who tire of it. It was not enough to be pleasing. Pleasures grow dull with repetition. To remain indispensable, she must offer something deeper, counsel, companionship, the sense that without her, the king himself would drift. Louis XV, ever drawn toward ease and distraction, found in her a steadiness he had not expected. She listened when he spoke of the burdens of reign, when he confessed his weariness of ritual and duty. She answered not as a subject, but as a confidant, gently shaping his thoughts, offering comfort without pressure. In her presence, he was not the distant sovereign, but the man behind the crown, allowed to sigh, to laugh, to wonder aloud. For this reason, he kept her near, and for this reason she held a place no rival could easily dislodge. Yet the court continued its murmurs. They could not forgive that a woman of bourgeois birth now presided over entertainments, received petitioners, and moved freely beside the king. They muttered that she was ambitious, that she sought to manipulate him for her own gain. Satirical poems were copied and spread, mocking her as vulgar, painting her as a puppet master. These pamphlets wounded her, though she did not show it. She learned to smile when others laughed behind fans, to bow when courtiers stiffened their shoulders. Her silence became its own weapon. It denied them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. It was in this crucible of envy that she learned endurance. Each day she awoke to play the role anew, her identity layered like the silks she wore. Beneath the jewels and cosmetics was the same woman who once gazed at Versailles from outside its gates, yet now that memory seemed like another life. She had become someone else entirely, fashioned by circumstance, prophecy, and her own resolve. The question lingered. How much of Jeanne-Antoinette remained, and how much had dissolved into Madame de Pompadour? Perhaps even she no longer knew. There were moments of stillness when the weight of transformation pressed upon her. Alone at night, after the king had departed, she would unfasten her jewels, release her hair, and look into the mirror. The reflection gazing back was both familiar and strange. The girl of Paris and the mistress of Versailles intertwined. Did she whisper to herself her old name, remembering the scent of city streets, the hum of markets, the warmth of family? Or did she embrace entirely the new identity, silencing the echoes of the past? Such thoughts can only be imagined, for she left no confession of them. But the solitude of those moments, surrounded by gold yet wrapped in silence, must have been heavy. The transformation into Madame de Pompadour was not only personal, but symbolic. She embodied the shifting tides of France itself, where birth no longer guaranteed supremacy, where wit and elegance could carve a path through rigid hierarchies. To the nobility, she was a scandal. To the king, she was salvation. To the people of Paris, she was both fascination and target of satire. She stood at the crossroads of admiration and hatred, of tradition and change, and yet she endured. Each day she stepped once more into the corridors, her presence unshaken, her smile measured, her dignity intact. The courtiers might whisper, but she remained. The pamphlets might slander, but she persisted. In the quiet resilience of her transformation lay her triumph. For though she was surrounded by splendor, she carried within her the solitude of one who knows she is both adored and despised, cherished and condemned. And so the candle in her chamber burned low, its flame wavering yet refusing to die. As she sat beneath its glow, the jewels of the day set aside, the silence of the night pressing close. Outside, the wind moved softly against the palace walls, carrying with it the faintest echo of whispers that would never cease. The silence of her chamber lingered long after the last candle had guttered out. a hush broken only by the faint creak of timber as the palace settled into its nocturnal stillness. It was in such silence that Jeanne-Antoinette, now entirely Madame de Pompadour, gathered her strength for the role that had grown larger than Mistress, larger even than Marquise. For Louis XV, weary of both ceremonial duties and the endless factions of court, began to turn to her not merely for companionship, but for counsel. The intimacy of their bond, once confined to laughter and whispered words, stretched now into the affairs of the realm, until the line between affection and governance blurred into something neither fully defined nor entirely hidden. It began simply. The king, restless after the routine of audiences and councils, would come to her apartments in the evening. There, away from the stern eyes of ministers, he would speak more freely. He confessed his fatigue with intrigues, his uncertainty in the face of decisions, his desire for someone to hear him without calculation. Jeanne-Antoinette listened. She did not press him with advice too quickly, nor appear eager to steer. She let his words unfold, asking a question here, offering an observation there, until he began to realize that in her company he could think more clearly, as if her presence itself drew the fog from his mind. Slowly, imperceptibly, she became not only his comfort, but his mirror, reflecting back to him possibilities he might not have considered. The ministers of state sensed it soon enough. Matters discussed in council seemed to reappear in conversation with the king, softened or reshaped by words that bore her subtle cadence. Policies that might once have been dismissed suddenly gained his attention, while others faltered when he looked upon them with new doubt. To the ministers, it seemed as though another voice whispered behind his throne, a voice they could not control. Some were enraged, others wary, yet all understood that Madame de Pompadour was no longer simply a mistress to be endured. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a confidant. For Jeanne-Antoinette herself, this was both a triumph and a burden. She had sought to be indispensable, and now she was. Yet to influence a king was to invite resentment deeper than any jealousy of beauty. To the nobility, she was already an intruder. To the ministers, she became a rival. Pamphlets sharpened their satire, accusing her of meddling in affairs beyond her station, of steering France toward ruin for her own gain. But she endured, as she always had, by balancing visibility with restraint. She never publicly claimed influence, never boasted of counsel given. She let the king appear sovereign, even as she quietly guided his thoughts. Louis XV seemed to flourish under her attentions. He grew more animated, more engaged when she was near. Their evenings were filled with conversation that ranged from poetry to politics, from philosophy to diplomacy. She encouraged his interest in the arts, introducing him to new plays, new works of literature, new ideas stirring in Paris. In her presence, he was not only king, but man, and she, in listening to him, offered the rarest gift a monarch can receive, the sense of being understood. And yet intimacy of this kind is never without peril. To be confidant is to carry secrets, to bear the weight of a sovereign's doubts and weaknesses. Jeanne-Antoinette must have felt the heaviness of it when she was alone, when the laughter of the evening faded and the fire burned low. Did she wonder if she was shaping destiny too boldly, if her words might bend the path of France itself? Did she question whether she was guardian or usurper? The questions must have haunted her in those silent hours, though she revealed them to no one. For to doubt aloud would have been to invite ruin, and so she held her thoughts close, offering to the world only serenity. The courtiers observed the transformation. They saw the king more often at her side, not only at entertainments, but in moments that touched upon affairs of state. They saw petitioners seek her favor, hoping that through her their causes might reach his ears. They saw her smile quietly as the king spoke with renewed vigor, her eyes steady upon him, her presence unshaken. And they realized with bitterness that she was not passing fancy but enduring power. For Jeanne-Antoinette, the art of influence was subtle. She did not command, she suggested. She did not argue, she guided. Her power lay not in declarations, but in questions, in the gentle shaping of thought. And so she became something more than mistress, more than marquise. She became the companion who steadied a king's hand upon the helm of France, though no crown rested upon her brow. Yet this intimacy came at a cost. She was more isolated than ever, for who could she trust? Allies feared her influence as much as they desired it. Rivals watched for any misstep. Friends of the past drifted away, unable to share in the burden of her role. Even within her apartments, glittering with tapestries and gilded chairs, the air carried the weight of suspicion. She bore it alone, as she always had, with patience and quiet strength. One can imagine her at the close of an evening after the king had departed, seated at her writing desk. The ink glistened on the page as she recorded fragments of thought, letters to family, notes for herself. The fire crackled faintly, the palace hushed beyond the walls. Did she pause then, pen poised, and ask herself what destiny she was shaping? Did she see in her reflection the girl who once gazed through the gates and marvel at how far she had come? Such moments of reflection, unrecorded in history, must have existed, though only silence preserves them now. And so her role grew, as inevitable as the rising sun. Mistress she remained, but advisor she had become. The king leaned upon her, the court feared her, and she herself carried within her the knowledge that she was shaping not only her own fate, but the fate of a kingdom. Whether guided by prophecy or by her own unyielding will, she had stepped fully into the role history demanded of her. The scene closes with an image unresolved, a letter folded but left unopened upon her desk, the ink still glistening faintly in the candlelight, a secret thought sealed within. Outside the window the night deepens, carrying with it the weight of decisions yet to come, and the whisper of a destiny still unfolding. The letter lay folded upon her desk, its wax seal unbroken, the ink within drying into silence. Outside the window of her apartments, Versailles slumbered beneath the stars, but within those gilded walls a quiet revolution was taking shape, not of armies and banners, but of brushstrokes and porcelain, of theater and music, of beauty cultivated like a garden to soothe and persuade. For Madame de Pompadour, the unopened letter was only one fragment among many, a reminder that words and decrees were not the only instruments of influence. She had discovered that the language of art, of taste, of refinement could shape hearts as surely as any edict. It began with gatherings, intimate and unadorned. In her chambers she invited musicians to perform, actors to recite, painters to display their sketches. The king, fatigued by councils and the endless repetition of court ritual, found himself enlivened by these evenings. He listened as violins swelled, as voices recited the lines of Voltaire or Racine, as laughter rose from plays that sparkled with wit. These moments soothed him, reminded him that beyond politics there was a world of imagination, and Jeanne-Antoinette was its guide. In her presence, he discovered not only pleasure, but renewal. And so, slowly, she became the patroness of a cultural flowering, her favor elevating artists and shaping the very style of the age. Porcelain was among her passions. She lent her influence to the development of the Sèvres manufactory, ensuring that its delicate creations, luminous in color and fragile as air, became the envy of Europe. Plates, cups, vases, all bore the refinement she encouraged. Soft hues, graceful curves, intricate decoration that spoke of elegance without ostentation. To hold a piece of Sèvres porcelain was to hold a fragment of her vision, a whisper of her taste carried into the homes of nobles and monarchs alike. Thus beauty became diplomacy, porcelain became a token of prestige, and Pompadour's name was entwined with the refinement of a nation. Architecture, too, bore her imprint. She favored lighter forms, curves that softened rather than constrained, colors that shimmered like dawn rather than brooded like dusk. The Rococo style, playful yet graceful, seemed to mirror her own presence, elegant, charming, intimate rather than monumental. Where the heavy grandeur of past reigns had proclaimed authority, her influence sought to persuade through delight. Some dismissed it as frivolity, but beneath its ornament lay a philosophy that beauty could heal, that elegance could conceal harshness, that taste itself could be power. Writers and philosophers found her a willing ear. Voltaire, with his sharp wit, admired her intelligence. Diderot, though wary of court, recognized her support for the Encyclopédie, a work both celebrated and condemned. She could not always shield such projects from opposition, but her sympathy lent them courage. To speak with her was to find not only appreciation but understanding, for she was a woman who read, who questioned, who thought beyond the surface. Perhaps this is why critics accused her of overstepping. They could not endure the thought that a mistress might also be a mind. Her own creativity revealed itself in theater. She loved to act, to don costumes and step into roles, to recite lines that echoed through the small stage she arranged at Versailles. At these performances, she sometimes took leading parts, her voice steady, her gestures refined. To some, this seemed scandalous, a marquise on stage as though she were a mere actress. To others, it was enchanting, proof that she carried within her both the dignity of a lady and the vivacity of an artist. And for Louis XV, it was delight itself. He laughed, he applauded. He saw in her performances not only charm but devotion, for in acting she revealed a truth often hidden, that all of Versailles was theater, and that she, more than any, understood the roles they all must play. But art is never free of criticism. Pamphleteers mocked her patronage, calling it vanity. Courtiers muttered that she wasted royal funds on trifles. They saw in her influence a threat not only to politics, but to tradition, for she blurred the line between mistress and minister, between ornament and advisor. And yet, despite their resistance, her taste prevailed. The salons of Paris echoed her choices. The fashions of Europe followed her example. Hairstyles rose higher, gowns spread wider, colors shifted to match her preference. Even the very hue of pink, most delicate and luminous, came to be known as Pompadour pink. Thus her name was carried into fabrics, into walls, into porcelain, woven not only into scandal, but into style. Was it ambition that drove her, or simply delight in beauty? Perhaps both. She had endured slander, isolation, hostility. She had borne the solitude of her position with composure. To create beauty, to surround herself with art, was perhaps not only strategy, but solace. Each painting commissioned, each piece of porcelain perfected, each performance applauded, was a reminder that life could be shaped, ordered, refined. In beauty, she found refuge from envy, strength against hostility, meaning in the midst of scandal. Yet even in these triumphs, doubt may have lingered. Did she ever wonder if her taste, so carefully cultivated, was truly hers, or merely another mask demanded by her role? Did she create because she loved beauty, or because beauty was the only weapon she could wield without drawing a blade? History leaves us only traces, portraits of her serene face, objects fashioned under her patronage, words written by others about her. The inner voice remains silent, known only to the night when she set down her pen and extinguished her candle. Still, the legacy of her patronage endures. Versailles itself shimmered anew under her influence, lighter, more playful, more humane. The arts flourished in her circle, and through her the king himself was drawn into their glow. For a time, at least, beauty prevailed over bitterness, and the court, though it whispered, could not deny the elegance she spread through every hall. And so the unopened letter remained on her desk, forgotten amidst sketches of porcelain, drafts of plays, samples of fabric. Its contents may have been urgent or trivial, but it mattered little. For in that moment beauty itself was her correspondence, and Versailles, was reading it in every curve of porcelain, every line of poetry, every note of music drifting through her apartments. The scene fades with an image unresolved, porcelain cooling in a kiln, unseen hands tending the fire, the glow within as fragile and enduring as the flame she carried in her heart. The glow within the kiln, steady and hidden, flickered like a secret heartbeat, its warmth tending the porcelain that would soon emerge fragile yet enduring. But beyond the sheltered workshop, the fires that surrounded Madame de Pompadour were of a different kind, fires of resentment, envy, and moral disdain, just as porcelain, delicate and luminous, invited both admiration and the risk of shattering, so too did her presence at Versailles invite admiration entwined with hatred. For as her influence grew, so too did the voices that sought to undo her, until the very air of court seemed heavy with suspicion. The nobles who had long guarded their privileges bristled at her ascendancy. They could tolerate a mistress of passing favor, for such indulgences had marked the reigns of kings before. But Pompadour was no fleeting shadow. She endured, she advised, she presided. Her salons flourished, her taste spread, her counsel lingered in the king's decisions. To the aristocracy, this was intolerable, that the daughter of a financier should outshine duchesses, that a woman of no noble lineage should shape the culture of France. Such an affront was more than pride could bear, and so their whispers thickened into campaigns of scorn. The clergy, too, joined the chorus. They denounced her as a sinner, a temptress leading the king away from virtue, a symbol of moral corruption at the heart of France. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the decay of the kingdom, and though her name was not always spoken, the implication was clear. She became the embodiment of what they despised: pleasure, art, independence, influence, exercised by a woman. To attack her was to cloak resentment in righteousness, to dress envy in the garments of morality. Pamphlets multiplied in the streets of Paris. Anonymous hands wrote verses mocking her, lampoons that circulated in secret but were read with relish by those eager to believe scandal. They called her manipulative, accused her of draining the treasury, of leading the king into weakness. They painted her as a schemer who held France itself in thrall, whose smile concealed ambition, whose beauty was but a mask for corruption. None of these charges were proved, yet truth mattered little. The pamphlets spread like sparks upon dry straw, and the image of Pompadour as a dangerous enchantress took root in the public imagination. Even within Versailles, friends were scarce. Courtiers bowed before her with polished gestures, yet behind their fans they whispered of her downfall, predicting that the king's passion would cool and she would be discarded like those before her. Some smiled in her presence while plotting against her in the next chamber. Her allies were those who benefited from her favor, but loyalty at Versailles was always provisional, shifting with the tide of fortune. She lived surrounded not by companions, but by watchers, each waiting for her to stumble. And yet, Jeanne-Antoinette endured. She bore the weight of these attacks with composure, never allowing bitterness to show. Her smile remained serene, her voice gentle, her presence unshaken. Perhaps she understood that scandal was the natural companion of prominence, that to shine brightly was always to cast a shadow others would curse. Or perhaps she had learned from her earliest years that endurance is the truest armor against hostility. Whatever her secret, she did not falter. There is a strange paradox in scandal. The more it seeks to destroy, the more it immortalizes. Every pamphlet that mocked her name spread it further. Every whisper that condemned her only confirmed her importance. Had she been insignificant, the court would have ignored her. That they conspired against her proved her power, and so the very venom hurled at her became a measure of her influence. Still, one wonders what she felt in solitude. Did the accusations wound her spirit in ways she concealed? Did she fear that one day the king might be swayed by the tide of disapproval? Did she ever dream of retreat, of leaving behind the glittering cage of Versailles for a quieter life where whispers could not follow? History records her serenity, but silence does not erase the ache beneath. Alone in her chambers, as she unpinned her jewels and let the rouge fade from her cheeks, she must have felt the weariness of being both adored and despised, cherished by one man and condemned by many. The king, though devoted, could not silence the hostility entirely. Louis XV stood by her, shielding her from dismissal, granting her honors, affirming her presence. Yet he too was vulnerable to criticism, and the more she was blamed, the more his own image suffered. The monarchy itself became entangled in scandal, its dignity compromised by the whispers that surrounded its mistress. Thus Pompadour bore not only her own burden, but that of a kingdom's perception, her presence reflecting upon the very crown. The question lingers. Was she manipulative, as her enemies claimed, or simply enduring, as her admirers believed? The truth, like porcelain, is delicate, layered with both fragility and strength. She sought influence, yes, but influence was necessary for survival in a court where idleness meant oblivion. She shaped taste, yes, but taste was her language, her means of expression in a world where women were seldom allowed voice. She endured scandal not because she was free of ambition, but because ambition was bound to her very survival. And so the resentment thickened, like storm clouds gathering above Versailles. Pamphlets drifted through Paris like dead leaves, sermons echoed in churches, courtiers sharpened their tongues. Yet Madame de Pompadour remained at the king's side, her presence unbroken, her smile serene. For she knew that storms pass, that whispers fade, and that the kiln of hostility, like the kiln of porcelain, could temper as well as destroy. The scene closes upon an image unresolved, a pamphlet caught by the wind, its mocking verses tumbling across the gravel of the palace courtyard, its ink blurring as it is soaked by rain. And within the palace a woman sits quietly, her composure intact, while beyond her walls envy and resentment scatter like the storm. The rain blurred the ink of the pamphlet, its words dissolving into streaks upon the stones of the courtyard, yet the bitterness they carried did not vanish so easily. Beyond the palace walls, Europe itself was entering a storm, one fiercer than whispered scandal, a storm of armies and treaties, of cannon and loss. The 7 Years' War, though it would later be given that name, began as ripples of tension, alliances drawn and redrawn across a continent where every monarch measured their power against rivals. For Louis XV, reluctant in spirit and weary of decision, the burden of war fell heavily. And as so often happened, the blame, whether deserved or not, turned toward the woman at his side. Madame de Pompadour had never been trained in diplomacy or warfare, yet her closeness to the king meant her presence could not be separated from the decisions he made. Ministers resented her influence. Courtiers accused her of meddling. Pamphleteers claimed she steered the ship of France into peril. When alliances shifted, when France turned toward Austria, embracing the Empress Maria Theresa against the ambitions of Prussia and England, it was whispered that Pompadour herself had woven this new bond, encouraged by her affection for the Empress, who had addressed her with flattering letters. From one woman to another, Maria Theresa had written, words that delighted Jeanne-Antoinette but enraged her enemies. To them it was proof that France was governed not by reason of state, but by the whims of a mistress, swayed by flattery. The war spread like fire through dry fields. Battles were fought in Europe, in North America, in distant colonies across oceans. Victories were rare for France, defeats frequent and bitter. Armies faltered, treasuries drained, pride withered, and in every failure, every loss, her name was invoked. "It is Madame de Pompadour who guides him," the critics sneered. she who whispers in his ear while soldiers die. Whether she had spoken of strategy or not mattered little. Perception became truth. In the minds of many, the war was hers as much as the king's. The weight of such accusations must have pressed upon her shoulders, yet she bore it with the same composure that had carried her through scandal. She did not retreat, did not vanish into the shadows, but remained visible, steadfast beside the king. She encouraged him in his gloom, consoled him when news of defeats arrived, urged him not to yield to despair. "Courage, sire," she is said to have told him, "for at times fortune changes." These words, simple and calm, revealed her strength. Where ministers quarreled, where generals despaired, she offered steadiness, not of policy, but of spirit. She became less mistress than anchor, the companion who steadied him when the storm of war threatened to overwhelm. Yet the storm around her grew. In Paris, anger boiled. The people, who once had named Louis the well-beloved, now grumbled of betrayal and weakness. Taxes rose, defeats mounted, confidence waned. The name of Pompadour was spat with contempt in the streets, painted upon pamphlets as a curse, whispered in taverns as the true reason for France's misfortunes. That a woman could become the symbol of a nation's despair revealed much of how easily blame seeks a single figure, how scandal finds a vessel for anger. And still she endured. She responded not with fury but with resilience, turning her attention all the more toward the arts, as though to affirm that beauty could survive even in times of defeat. Plays continued in her salons, porcelain still shimmered from the kilns, music rose in her chambers. To some, this seemed frivolous, a mistress indulging in pleasures while the kingdom bled. But perhaps it was something deeper, a defiance against despair, a refusal to let darkness consume entirely the light of refinement. For Jeanne-Antoinette understood that power is not only measured in victories of arms, but in the spirit of a people. And though war pressed heavily upon France, her patronage reminded all that culture endured. Still, one must wonder, did she ever feel the sharpness of guilt when letters from battlefields arrived, when names of lost soldiers were spoken? Did she ever lie awake in her bed, hearing in the distance the muffled beat of drums, asking herself if she bore some share of the blame? History offers no confession, only silence. But silence, too, speaks. For those who bear accusations, they cannot escape often carry them within, unspoken yet unforgotten. The king himself grew more withdrawn, more troubled as the war dragged on. He who had once been called the well-beloved now faced open criticism, his popularity withering. He leaned more heavily on her presence, finding in her steadiness a balm against his own faltering spirit. Without her, perhaps he would have crumbled entirely under the weight of discontent. With her, he at least endured, even as fortune turned against him. In this sense, her role in the war was not that of strategist, but of sustainer. She did not direct armies, but she steadied the hand of the king who must answer for them. The war did not end quickly. It stretched, year upon weary year, draining coffers, eroding pride, darkening the glitter of Versailles, and always her name was entwined with it, as though she herself marched beside the armies, as though every defeat carried her signature. Such was the power of perception, and such was the cost of influence. To stand beside a king is to bear his burdens, to be blamed for his failings, to be accused of shaping his choices even when silent. And yet, even as her enemies sharpened their knives, she remained. For Jeanne-Antoinette knew what many did not, that storms, however fierce, must one day pass, and that those who endure may yet outlast the thunder. She placed her trust not in popularity, which shifts like wind, but in resilience, which holds like stone. And so, while pamphlets spread venom and sermons denounced her, she sat quietly in her apartments, listening to music, arranging flowers, speaking gently to the king. The rain upon the courtyard stones ceased at last, Leaving behind the blurred scraps of pamphlets, their venom dissolved into meaningless streaks. Yet resentment did not vanish with the rain. It lingered, heavy as the air before another storm, waiting for its moment to rise again. And within Versailles, the echo of distant cannon fire seemed to merge with the silence of its gilded halls, a reminder that beauty and war, refinement and ruin existed side by side. The image remains unresolved, a cannon's echo fading into stillness, and in the king's chambers, a woman seated quietly, her voice calm as she tells him, "Courage, sire," while beyond their walls the kingdom mutters her name with bitterness. The echo of cannon faded into the stillness, yet its vibration lingered in the heart of Versailles, a reminder of battles fought far away and of burdens carried within. For Louis XV, wearied by the weight of war and the discontent that seeped through his kingdom, the brightness of desire began to dim. Passion, that flame which once burned hotly in the intimacy of his chambers, cooled as the years passed. But where many might have seen this as the end of Pompadour's reign beside him, it became instead the transformation of her role. From mistress, she evolved into something rarer and perhaps even stronger, the trusted friend, the companion whose presence offered not passion's fever, but comfort's steadying warmth. The king was a man prone to melancholy. Though called the well-beloved in earlier days, he carried within him a restlessness, a dissatisfaction that no embrace could wholly soothe. When the thrill of passion faded, many expected Pompadour to vanish as so many others had before her. Yet she remained, not through force, but through the quiet persistence of affection. For she had given him more than beauty. She had given him conversation, sympathy, and the sense of being understood. These things, rarer than desire, are harder to discard. And so, when the fires of intimacy cooled, Louis XV still sought her presence, not in secrecy but openly, as a confidant and companion. This transformation was not without its costs. To remain at Versailles, while no longer sharing the king's bed, was to invite scorn of another kind. Enemies whispered that she held power by manipulation, that she must use deceit to maintain her place. They could not imagine that friendship, plain and unadorned, could bind a king more firmly than passion. But Pompadour understood differently. She knew that affection tempered by trust was more enduring than desire, and she knew, too, that her role now was not to inflame but to console, not to command but to steady. She offered the king diversions still, but gentler ones. The theater she loved so dearly became a refuge for them both, where laughter might briefly chase away gloom. She acted in plays performed within her own apartments, sometimes in comic roles that delighted him, reminding him of a world less heavy than the one that pressed upon his shoulders. She sang, she played music, she created small pockets of light in the shadow of his melancholy. In these ways she preserved not only his affection, but his very spirit. For without her, the weight of solitude might have crushed him entirely. Louis XV himself acknowledged this bond. When courtiers pressed against her, when pamphlets accused her, when whispers rose anew, he defended her not with the ardor of passion, but with the steadiness of reliance. He declared that she was indispensable to him, that she knew his heart as none other did. For a king surrounded always by formality, by ministers who flattered or argued, by courtiers who sought favor, the honesty of companionship was a treasure beyond measure. In Pompadour, he found the one who saw him not as king, but as man. And what of her in these years of transformation? Did she grieve the cooling of passion, the loss of intimacy that had once defined her place? Or did she welcome the change, relieved at last from the burden of desire's expectations, free now to cultivate a different kind of influence? Perhaps she felt both, for she was human, not stone. There may have been moments of sorrow when she recalled the intensity of earlier days, and moments of quiet satisfaction when she realized she had endured where others had fallen. To survive as mistress is rare, To survive as friend is rarer still. But such endurance came at a price of solitude. She had no lover now, no husband, no family close at hand. The child she had borne in her marriage, Alexandrine, had died young, a grief she carried silently. The king, though devoted, belonged always to France before he belonged to himself, and the courtiers who smiled to her face sharpened their tongues behind her back. In the stillness of night, when she set aside the silks and jewels, when she looked into her mirror, did she ever ask herself what life she might have lived had destiny not carried her to Versailles? Did she wonder whether happiness lay elsewhere, in a quieter life with less splendor but more peace? Such thoughts must have come, fleeting as shadows upon the wall, yet she did not let them linger, for she had chosen this path, or perhaps been chosen by it, and she bore it with the dignity she had cultivated since girlhood. The court itself adjusted to her altered role. Ministers who had once feared her influence as mistress now recognized her as a channel of steadiness. She no longer wielded allure but reputation. She became a figure courted for advice, for intercession, for reassurance. To some, she was still the enemy, but to others, she was an ally whose counsel might guide the king more gently than harsh argument. Thus her transformation reshaped not only her bond with Louis XV, but her place within Versailles itself. And so the image of their companionship endures, two figures seated together, not in passion but in quiet conversation, the king leaning toward her as she listens, her face calm, her eyes attentive. Around them the court hums with intrigue, ministers debate, armies falter abroad, pamphlets circulate in the streets. Yet within that moment there is only the gentle exchange of words, the trust of two souls who have endured storms together and found in each other a harbor. The courtiers may have whispered that she was no longer mistress, but what they could not erase was her presence. They could not deny that she still walked beside the king, still shared his thoughts, still shaped his days. They could not explain how friendship, dismissed as weak by those who craved passion, could prove stronger than scandal. They could not understand that to Louis XV she was not merely memory, but necessity. And so, as the canon echoes faded into memory, the role of Madame de Pompadour shifted but did not diminish. Mistress no longer, she became companion, advisor, confidant, friend. Not the fever of desire, but the steadiness of affection held her in place, and in that steadiness she revealed a truth that Versailles itself could not deny, that power does not always blaze. Sometimes it endures as a quiet flame. The scene closes with an image unresolved, two figures walking slowly through a garden at dusk, not touching, yet glancing back at one another, bound not by passion but by something gentler, something more enduring. In the garden at dusk they had walked together, two figures bound not by passion but by companionship, and in that fading light the air carried with it the chill reminder of time's passage. For though Madame de Pompadour still moved with grace through the gilded corridors of Versailles, her body had begun to betray her. The years of endurance, the storms of scandal and war, the solitude masked by serenity, all left their imprint. Her lungs, always delicate, grew weaker. A cough lingered, soft at first, then insistent, until it became a shadow that followed her into every chamber. Illness in Versailles was never private. Each pale cheek, each falter of breath was noted by watchful eyes, repeated in whispers, embroidered in gossip. Some saw in her failing health a sign of divine judgment, the wages of sin, as the clergy sternly reminded their flocks. Others whispered with a mixture of pity and calculation, wondering how long she might endure, how soon her place at the king's side would be vacated for another. Yet Louis XV, though wearied by many burdens, did not abandon her. He remained near, loyal in his own fashion, seeking her counsel, sharing her company even as her strength waned. The court, however, grew restless. Rivals circled, hoping for her fall, yet finding themselves disappointed as days turned to months. and still she endured. She withdrew more often to her apartments, where silence was broken only by the rustle of servants, the turning of pages, the faint sound of her cough against embroidered pillows. Flowers, her constant companions, filled the rooms with fragrance, roses, lilies, violets, tokens of beauty that softened the edges of pain. In their delicate blooms, she found comfort, as though the transience of petals mirrored her own fragility, yet also promised renewal. In these years of failing health, melancholy deepened. She had always carried solitude within her, even at the height of splendor, but now it pressed more heavily. She reflected upon the path that had brought her here, the prophecy of her mother, the childhood gaze through Versailles gates, the triumph of her elevation, the storm of scandal, the burden of blame during war. What had it all yielded? Influence, yes. Splendor, yes. But also loneliness, the ache of absence where children might have been, where family might have offered solace. She had given herself to the role of mistress and advisor, to the kingdom itself, and in return she had been immortalized as scandal and style. Was that enough? Did she wonder in the hush of night whether another life, less adorned but more peaceful, might have brought her greater happiness? Yet such reflections did not consume her entirely. Even as her body weakened, her mind remained engaged. She read, she corresponded, she continued to patronize the arts. Actors still came to perform in her chambers. Musicians still played soft melodies that lifted her spirit. She encouraged new works, supported new projects, her name still entwined with beauty. To those who visited, she appeared calm, gracious, uncomplaining, her dignity intact even as pain deepened. Perhaps this was her greatest strength, that she could wear serenity as a garment even in suffering, offering the world not her weakness, but her poise. Louis XV, though a man not easily moved by sorrow, showed tenderness in these years. He visited her, sat beside her, spoke with her of matters both trivial and grave. Their bond, no longer one of passion, was that of two souls who had weathered storms together, who had known both delight and despair, and who found in each other the comfort of endurance. He trusted her still, relied upon her counsel, valued her presence. When others doubted her importance, he affirmed it, not with grand declarations, but with the quiet constancy of his companionship. The courtiers could not understand. They expected her fall, yet she remained. They predicted her dismissal, yet she endured. They mocked her frailty, yet she carried herself with grace. In her very endurance lay her defiance, a refusal to vanish quietly, a determination to remain a presence until her final breath. She had entered Versailles with prophecy in her cradle and left her mark upon its halls. She would not now be erased by weakness. And so the image of Pompadour in these years is not one of triumph, but of quiet resilience. A woman seated in a chamber perfumed with flowers, her breath shallow, her cough soft yet persistent, her hands resting upon the pages of a book. Sunlight filters through lace curtains, casting fragile patterns upon her gown. In her eyes there is both weariness and serenity, both sorrow and acceptance. She's at once diminished and unbroken, fragile in body yet steadfast in spirit. Mortality had always lingered at the edge of her story, but now it pressed closer. Each day reminded her of its presence, each night deepened its shadow. Yet even as death approached, she lived as she had always done, with dignity, with taste, with composure. For to Madame de Pompadour, the shaping of one's image was not deceit, but art, a way of enduring in a world where judgment never ceased. And so she continued to play her part upon the stage of Versailles until the curtain should fall. The scene fades with an image unresolved, a cough echoing softly against gilded walls, a hand pressing lightly to her breast, and outside her window the rustling of leaves, as if the trees themselves whispered of the fragility of life. The cough lingered, soft but insistent, reverberating faintly against the gilded walls of her chamber, and yet from this frailty she drew a curious strength. For Madame de Pompadour, weakened in body though she was, found renewal in the world of theater, that realm where reality and illusion could meet upon a stage, where sorrow could be masked by laughter, where the burdens of court could dissolve into music and verse. If her lungs betrayed her, if her flesh grew fragile, still her spirit insisted on creation. She turned again to her beloved pastime, the staging of plays within Versailles itself, plays where she was not only patron but performer. The theater at Versailles was not vast but intimate, a space fashioned within her apartments, adorned with painted scenery and curtains, its boards polished for performance. Here she gathered friends, courtiers, musicians, and actors, weaving together evenings that shimmered with artifice, yet offered truth disguised as entertainment. To watch Pompadour upon the stage was to glimpse both art and revelation. For though she wore costumes of shepherdesses or queens, though she recited lines penned by dramatists, she revealed in each gesture something of herself. The court, ever eager for diversion, attended these performances with curiosity. Some sneered that it was unbecoming for a marquise to play at acting. Others whispered that she sought to rival professional actresses. Yet when she stepped upon the stage, her voice steady, her presence commanding, even her detractors were silenced. Louis XV himself delighted in these spectacles. For a man so often dulled by the weight of ceremony, the laughter of comedy, or the tender sigh of tragedy within Pompadour's salon brought renewal. He applauded her performances, encouraged her enthusiasm, and found in these evenings a refuge from ministers and petitions, from war reports and endless intrigue. Here he was not monarch but spectator, charmed by the art his companion brought to life. In this theater, Pompadour became both muse and mirror, offering him a vision of joy that contrasted with the gloom of his reign. For Jeanne-Antoinette, theater was more than diversion. It was an art that revealed the essence of existence, the roles all mortals are compelled to play. She had long understood that Versailles itself was a theater, its courtiers actors, its rituals scenes, its monarch the central figure in a drama endlessly repeated. By stepping onto the stage, she did not escape this reality but illuminated it. She showed that life itself is performance, that each smile, each bow, each whispered word is part of a script written by time and circumstance. Perhaps in playing roles she felt a certain honesty, for the mask of an actress could sometimes speak more truth than the face of a courtier. The plays she favored were often light, pastoral comedies where shepherds wooed shepherdesses, where misunderstandings resolved in harmony. Yet behind their simplicity lay deeper meaning. Was she not herself a shepherdess who had captivated a king, a woman of humble birth who now stood among princes? Did she not enact in art the very transformation that defined her life? The courtiers may have laughed at the rustic costumes, but they could not ignore the resonance, that beneath the play lay allegory, and beneath allegory lay truth. Actors and writers, grateful for her patronage, composed works to suit her taste. Music swelled through her theater, verses floated through candlelit air, applause rang in a chamber where intimacy softened grandeur. These moments, fragile as petals, sustained her in times of illness. For while her lungs weakened, her voice upon the stage gave her strength. To act was to defy mortality, to declare that beauty and art could outlast frailty. Each performance was a small triumph, a gesture of endurance cloaked in delight. Not all admired. Some courtiers muttered that she degraded her station, that a mistress turned actress was evidence of the monarchy's decay. Satirical verses mocked her roles, ridiculed her performances. Yet such criticisms mattered little, for she knew that ridicule was her shadow, forever present. Better to be mocked for acting than forgotten in silence. And so she continued, offering the king and those who would watch her a theater not of grandeur, but of intimacy, where she could reveal in art what life compelled her to conceal. What did she feel stepping onto that small stage, the lamps casting light upon her powdered face, the audience of courtiers waiting? Did her heart race with fear, or did she feel a calm exhilaration, knowing that in this moment she controlled the gaze of all? Perhaps both, for theater blends fear with delight, and she had lived long enough in the theater of Versailles to master both. Each line spoken was not merely art, but affirmation. I endure, I remain, I am more than what you whisper of me. The king's applause, gentle but sincere, must have been her greatest reward, for though the courtiers sneered, though pamphleteers mocked, Louis XV laughed and smiled, his eyes softened by delight. To bring joy to a weary monarch was itself an act of service, perhaps as valuable as any counsel. And so the theater became not only her refuge, but her gift, a balm she offered to a man weighed down by his crown. In these evenings one sees her most clearly, not as mistress, not as patron, not as scandal, but as a woman who loved art, who found in performance a mirror of her own existence, who turned fragility into creation. The cough may have lingered, but on stage her voice rang steady. The melancholy may have pressed upon her, but in laughter she found reprieve, and the solitude may have haunted her, but in performance she was never alone, for all eyes turned toward her, if only for an hour. The curtain would fall, applause would echo, the actors would bow, and once more she would retreat into her chamber, unpin her hair, remove her costume. The silence returned, the cough returned, the solitude returned. Yet something remained, the memory of laughter, the warmth of applause, the knowledge that for a brief moment she had been more than mistress, more than advisor. She had been artist, creator, performer, and in that role she had revealed a truth deeper than scandal could touch. And so the image of Pompadour endures, a woman stepping lightly across a small stage, her gown shimmering in candlelight, her voice reciting lines that blend art with life. The applause fades, the curtain falls, and into the silence she returns, the echo of theater lingering in the gilded halls. The applause faded, soft as leaves falling in autumn, until only silence remained in her chamber, silence broken by the faint crackle of dying candles. And in that silence, Madame de Pompadour longed for spaces beyond the glitter of Versailles, beyond its endless theater of whispers and rivalry. She had given herself fully to the stage of court, but her body, frail and weary, sought gentler scenes, places where air moved freely, where the sky stretched without painted ceilings, where the murmur of water and the whisper of trees could replace the ceaseless rustle of silk. Thus she turned increasingly to her private havens, Petit Trianon and Bellevue, retreats where she might breathe more easily, where beauty could be cultivated not as performance, but as solace. The Petit Trianon, a small chateau nestled within the gardens of Versailles, had been conceived as a place of escape from ceremony, a dwelling where intimacy replaced spectacle. Though it would later be famed through another queen, in Pompadour's time it was her refuge. Here, away from the vast halls and the sharp eyes of courtiers, she could walk quietly through gardens of her own design. She oversaw plantings with meticulous care, selecting flowers not only for their fragrance, but for their colors, arranging them in patterns that soothed the eye and calmed the mind. Roses unfolded like soft secrets, lilacs breathed perfume into the air, paths wound gently between lawns where silence seemed a form of music. To walk there was to feel the weight of Versailles fall away, to remember that life could be tender as well as ruthless. Bellevue, perched above the Seine, offered another sanctuary. The name itself, Beautiful View, captured what she sought: vistas of river and sky, horizons unbroken by the strict geometry of the palace gardens. At Bellevue, she created interiors warm with comfort rather than rigid with ceremony. She invited a small circle of trusted friends, artists, philosophers, musicians, where conversation could flow without the barbed undercurrent of courtly intrigue. The walls held paintings she had chosen, works of grace rather than grandeur. Porcelain gleamed upon tables, not as symbols of power, but as objects of delight. Here she could laugh without fear of being mocked, speak without weighing each word against rumor, rest without eyes watching for weakness. For Pompadour, these retreats were not abandonment of Versailles, but necessary refuge. She knew that to endure at court she must sometimes withdraw, must breathe air not thickened by envy. In Bellevue and Petit Trianon, she could rediscover her humanity, the part of herself that was not marquise or mistress, not patron or advisor, but simply Jeanne-Antoinette, a woman who loved gardens, who delighted in music, who cherished conversation untainted by ambition. In these spaces, she was reminded that beneath the gilded armor of her role, she was mortal, fragile, capable of joy in the simplest of beauties. The king himself sometimes visited these havens, though he never entirely shed the mantle of his rank. At Bellevue, however, he seemed more at ease, less the sovereign than the man who found rest in her companionship. Together they strolled among the gardens, gazed across the river, listened to music performed in intimate chambers. Perhaps he, too, found relief from the suffocating weight of court. In her havens, he could be received not with pomp, but with affection, not as monarch, but as friend. Yet even these sanctuaries were not free from criticism. Courtiers whispered that she built retreats to flaunt her power, that she withdrew to Bellevue as a queen might to a palace of her own. They accused her of extravagance, of vanity, of arrogance. They could not imagine that a woman surrounded always by splendor might still crave simplicity, that gardens and views could be more necessary to her than jewels. But such misunderstandings mattered little. For Pompadour, the creation of these retreats was not display but survival. Without them, she might have crumbled beneath the unending strain of Versailles. With them, she endured. In Bellevue, especially, she found herself drawn to the play of light upon the river, the shimmer of water beneath shifting skies. She would sit for hours watching boats drift slowly, their sails catching the breeze, their movement steady and unhurried. Perhaps she envied their freedom, their escape from the rigidity of court, or perhaps she saw in them an allegory of her own life, a vessel navigating uncertain currents, buffeted by winds of scandal, yet still afloat, still moving onward. Within the rooms of Bellevue, laughter sometimes rang truer than at Versailles. Friends recited verses, musicians played new compositions, artists sketched her likeness in moments less formal than portraiture demanded. These were evenings of warmth, where wit sparkled not with malice but with joy, where she could be herself without the heavy mask of role. In such moments one glimpses her not as scandal, not as symbol, but as woman, gentle, intelligent, longing for beauty. Still, she could not remain forever in retreat. The demands of Versailles called her back. The king relied upon her presence. The courtiers watched her every absence. Yet each return was softened by memory of her havens. Each whisper endured more easily for having been refreshed by silence in gardens. In this way, Bellevue and Petit Trianon were not escapes, but pillars, sustaining her in the endless play of power. What did she feel in those quiet hours among flowers and views? Did she regret the path that had brought her into Versailles' cage? Did she imagine what her life might have been had she remained in Paris, hosting salons without stepping into scandal? Or did she accept her destiny fully, content to carve out havens where she could, grateful for the fragments of peace that beauty allowed? We cannot know, for she left no diary of such confessions. But perhaps the gardens themselves, the houses she built, the flowers she chose, speak more eloquently than words. They tell us that she sought not only splendor, but serenity, not only influence, but solace, not only survival, but grace. And so the image lingers. Madame de Pompadour seated at Bellevue, gazing through open windows toward the mist rising from the Seine, the air cool upon her face, her hands resting lightly upon folded letters she has chosen not to read. Outside, the garden stirs with wind, flowers bowing as though in reverence, while within the chamber a woman breathes deeply, fragile lungs drinking in the quiet she cannot find at Versailles. The mist drifted upward from the Seine, soft and pale, wrapping the view from Bellevue in a veil of quiet mystery. Madame de Pompadour, seated by the open window, breathed deeply of that cool air, as if drawing into herself the calm the river offered. Yet even here, away from Versailles, she could not escape the truth that her very presence, her choices, her tastes, had become threads woven into the fabric of France. For in salons and workshops, in drawing rooms and ateliers, her name was already whispered not only as scandal but as style. Fashion itself bent toward her, colors bore her mark, and the kingdom found itself shaped by her elegance as much as by her counsel. It began with fabrics. The silks she chose, shimmering in hues both delicate and bold, soon found imitators. The weavers of Lyons, attentive to the desires of Versailles, discovered that a shade selected by Pompadour would be demanded across France within weeks. A pale pink of subtle radiance, neither timid nor garish, became so associated with her that it carried her very name, Rose Pompadour. Gowns cut in lines she favored, hairstyles arranged in the manner she wore, spread first through the noble women of court, then outward into the city, until all who sought refinement measured themselves against her example. Jewels, too, reflected her influence. She wore them with restraint, preferring arrangement to excess, balance to ostentation. Diamonds were set not to overwhelm but to highlight, pearls chosen to soften rather than dazzle. Courtiers studied her appearance, eager to replicate the harmony she embodied. To imitate Pompadour was not merely to flatter the mistress of the king, it was to align oneself with the very center of taste, with the axis around which courtly elegance revolved. But her influence extended further still. Interior design, furniture, porcelain, all bore her signature. She preferred lighter forms, delicate carvings, curves that suggested grace rather than authority. Rooms decorated under her guidance gleamed with pastels, gilding softened by pale blue or green, motifs of flowers and shells, arabesques that danced lightly across panels. This Rococo style, dismissed by some as frivolous, became the emblem of the age, shaping not only Versailles but homes across Europe. What had once been considered extravagance was now elegance. What had once been fashion was now legacy. Pompadour understood that style was not vanity but expression. She had endured ridicule, slander, hostility, yet she knew that beauty could outlast bitterness. A pamphlet might be forgotten, but a porcelain vase remained, a gown remembered, a portrait enduring. To shape taste was to shape memory, and she embraced this role with the same composure she brought to all else. Her salons glittered with objects chosen not for cost, but for harmony, her very presence teaching those around her that refinement was a form of art, that elegance was a discipline as well as a delight. The king himself, though less inclined to fashion, followed her guidance. His apartments reflected her choices, his entertainments her taste, his gifts to allies and mistresses of his ministers often bore her influence. She shaped not only how France looked, but how it was seen. Foreign ambassadors reported not only on battles and treaties, but on Pompadour's gowns, her jewels, her style, for they knew that in her taste was revealed the spirit of the court. Thus she became more than mistress, more than confidant. She was tastemaker of a kingdom, her name embroidered into the culture of her age. Yet this influence carried its shadows. Critics mocked her as vain, accusing her of squandering wealth on silks and porcelains, while France bled in war. They saw in her style not elegance but corruption. the frivolity of a court detached from suffering. Each gown became a symbol of excess, each jewel an accusation. Pamphlets ridiculed the very pink that bore her name, portraying it as the color of decadence. To the poor in Paris, such luxury seemed insult. To the nobles, it seemed affront. And yet, even as they mocked, they imitated. Even as they sneered, they followed. Envy and admiration walked hand in hand. One wonders how she felt, knowing her choices carried such weight. Did she find joy in the influence, delight in seeing her colors spread, her styles copied? Or did she feel the heaviness of it, the knowledge that each ribbon she wore would be scrutinized, each jewel judged, each gown mocked as much as admired? Perhaps both, for influence is both crown and chain, glory and burden. And perhaps, too, she found solace in knowing that even when whispers sought to diminish her, her taste would endure, woven into fabrics, shaped into porcelain, carved into wood. Artists immortalized her. Bocci painted her in silks, surrounded by books and flowers, embodying not only beauty but intellect and grace. These portraits, spread in copies, reinforced her image as patron and tastemaker. Critics may have scorned, but painters captured her as serene, cultured, luminous. Through their art, her influence reached beyond France, her name recognized across Europe as emblem of refinement. And yet, beneath the silk and paint, beneath the style and influence, was still the woman who coughed softly in her chamber, who longed for air at Bellevue, who carried within her both strength and fragility. Did she ever tire of being symbol as much as self, of seeing her name woven into colors while her heart remained solitary? Did she ever wish that her legacy might be remembered not only for fashion but for kindness, not only for beauty but for endurance? Such questions linger, for the truth of her heart remains veiled, known only to her. The mist upon the Seine thickened, drifting upward to soften the outlines of trees, the sky dimming into twilight. Within Bellevue, Pompadour set aside a ribbon of pale pink, its silk gleaming faintly in the fading light. She watched it flutter as she placed it upon a table, the color alive even in shadow, as though her name itself had taken form in fabric. Outside, the river moved steadily onward, carrying reflections of sky and mist, while within the chamber the ribbon lay still, waiting for the hand that had chosen it to lift it once more. The ribbon lay still upon the table, its soft pink folds catching the last of the twilight, and beside it Madame de Pompadour rested her hand as if upon a memory. To the courtiers, she was the mistress who shaped fashion, the adviser who whispered in the king's ear, the woman who provoked scandal and envy. Yet beyond these surfaces, beneath the silks and jewels, there lived a gentleness that revealed itself in ways the pamphleteers never recorded. For behind the mask of scandal, she often offered kindness, to artists struggling for patronage, to friends seeking solace, to petitioners whose voices trembled as they dared approach her presence. Her apartments were not only adorned with porcelain and paintings, they were places where those in need might find a hearing. Painters who lacked commissions, writers whose works faced suppression, musicians without patrons, all found in her a champion. She purchased their canvases, commissioned their compositions, encouraged their performances. Many who would later be celebrated owed their survival to her early generosity. She saw in art not only beauty, but fragility, the fragile livelihood of those who created. Perhaps she recognized in them something of herself, the precariousness of existence, the need for protection against the indifference of the world. She extended this compassion beyond the arts. Petitioners came to her with trembling hands, men and women who sought favors they dared not ask of the king. Some came with pleas for mercy, others with hopes for advancement, others simply with burdens too heavy to carry alone. Pompadour, though accused of cold ambition, often received them with warmth. She listened, she interceded where she could, she offered comfort when she could not. To the poor she sometimes gave alms, discreetly, for charity done too openly would be mocked as performance. To her servants she was gentle, known for patience rather than severity. Though she lived amid grandeur, she did not treat those beneath her with disdain. Her friends, too, found in her a rare loyalty. In a court where alliances shifted like shadows, she remained constant to those she trusted. She supported them through scandal, defended them when accused, offered them refuge in her retreats. Some of her friendships were with women who envied her position, yet she extended generosity even to them. She knew that in the theater of Versailles, cruelty was easy, kindness difficult, and she chose the more difficult path whenever possible. This compassion was not always acknowledged. Critics saw only her proximity to power, her jewels, her gowns. They dismissed her kindness as calculation, her charity as manipulation. But those who received it knew otherwise. Letters survive of gratitude, words written by artists and petitioners who spoke of her gentleness with sincerity. They reveal a woman who, beneath the image of mistress and patron, cared deeply for those around her. Was this compassion born of her own struggles? Perhaps. She had known precariousness as a child, her family's fortunes unstable, her father disgraced. She had known the sting of mockery, the loneliness of scandal, the frailty of health. She understood what it meant to stand vulnerable before the judgment of others. And so, when others stood before her, vulnerable in their own ways, she responded not with scorn but with sympathy. It was as though her own scars had taught her tenderness. And yet one must not imagine her as saintly. She was ambitious. She sought influence. She played the game of court with skill. But ambition and compassion are not opposites. They may coexist within the same heart. She was both strategist and sympathizer, both mistress of style and guardian of the fragile. This complexity, this blending of strength and gentleness, gave her depth beyond the caricatures drawn by her enemies. Imagine her seated in her chamber at Bellevue, a petitioner before her, voice unsteady, hands clutching a letter of plea. She listens, her gaze steady, her tone calm. She promises to speak, to write, to intercede. The petitioner leaves with hope renewed, the weight upon their shoulders lightened. And Pompadour, left alone, folds the letter carefully, sets it upon her desk, and sighs softly, as though carrying the burden herself. This was her unseen labor, unrecorded in the grand narratives of history, yet perhaps more human than her salons and jewels. Even with her friends, her kindness took quiet forms. She wrote letters of comfort, invited them to Bellevue when scandal threatened them, offered them laughter and music when sorrow pressed heavily. She did not always succeed in shielding them from Versailles' cruelties, but she never abandoned them. In this loyalty, she revealed her truest strength, the capacity to remain constant in a world where constancy was rare. Perhaps this was why, even as critics mocked her, even as pamphlets defamed her, those who truly knew her remembered her with affection, not as manipulator, not as seductress, but as friend. They saw the gentleness that scandal concealed, the kindness that whispers ignored, and perhaps in the stillness of night, this was the part of herself she cherished most, not the mistress of a king, not the patron of art, but the woman who offered a hand to those in need. The ribbon still lay upon the table, pale pink against the fading light, as though symbol of her gentleness. Outside the window, the wind stirred softly, carrying the scent of flowers from her gardens. Within the chamber, silence held, broken only by her quiet breath, fragile but steady. In that moment she was neither scandal nor style, but simply a woman who knew that kindness, like beauty, endures. And so the image lingers, a hand extended, trembling, into another's, the gesture of one who offers comfort even in the midst of her own fragility. The trembling hand lingered in hers, a gesture of quiet compassion, and when it was withdrawn, the chamber seemed emptier, the silence heavier. Outside, Versailles continued its endless cycle of audiences and intrigues, but within, Madame de Pompadour sat in stillness, reflecting upon a truth she had long come to know. The burden of influence, once shared with the king's own will, was now hers to carry more heavily. For Louis XV, though still seated upon the throne of France, had grown weary of governance. The weight of decisions pressed upon him like a stone he no longer wished to lift. He sought escape in the forests with his hunts, in the gardens with his pleasures, in the quiet companionship of Pompadour herself. And thus, while the crown remained on his head, its cares slipped more and more into her keeping. Louis had never been a sovereign of tireless energy. He had moments of brilliance, of decisiveness, yet these were fleeting, and as years passed, he retreated further into detachment. The court, so attuned to every gesture of its king, observed this withdrawal with unease. Ministers grew frustrated, courtiers muttered that the king no longer reigned but merely presided, and always their eyes turned toward the woman beside him. If decisions faltered, it was whispered that Pompadour was to blame. If alliances shifted, it was said she had shaped them. If appointments displeased, it was assumed she had whispered the names. The burden of influence fell not only because she sought it, but because the king allowed it, preferring the refuge of her council to the quarrels of ministers. For Jeanne-Antoinette, this was both triumph and trial. To guide the king was to fulfill the prophecy spoken in her childhood, to achieve the role her mother had prepared her for. Yet to be the axis of his reliance was also to bear the resentment of a kingdom. She knew that each word she spoke might ripple into policy, that each gesture might alter careers, that each silence might be interpreted as decision. To guide gently was her art, but to guide constantly was her exhaustion. And still she endured, because to abandon him would have been to abandon the very essence of her place in history. Louis turned increasingly toward diversion. Hunting absorbed his energies. He rode into the forests with hounds and horns, the thrill of chase more vivid to him than the debates of councils. He sought amusements that dulled the monotony of reign, pleasures that distracted from discontent. Ministers despaired, courtiers muttered, the people grumbled, yet Pompadour remained by his side, the quiet figure who listened, who encouraged, who consoled. If his reign drifted, she sought to anchor it. If his spirit flagged, she offered steadiness. If he withdrew from responsibility, she bore it in silence. This was not power as the world imagines it, for she was not crowned, not seated in council, not recorded in decrees. Her influence was subtle, hidden in words spoken in private, in gestures made in passing, in the confidence she alone received. Yet it was power nonetheless, and all who observed knew it. She became the screen upon which the hopes and hatreds of the kingdom were projected, admired by those who sought her favor, despised by those who envied her place. To be mistress had been scandal enough. To be adviser was scandal multiplied. One wonders how she felt carrying such weight. Did she long for the days when her role had been confined to beauty, to laughter, to companionship, unburdened by politics? Did she resent that the king, who should have borne the crown's cares, instead leaned upon her frail shoulders? Or did she embrace it, seeing in his reliance the truest proof of her indispensability? Perhaps she felt all these at once, for human hearts seldom move in a single line. She endured because endurance was her nature, but endurance does not erase fatigue. At night, after the king had gone to his chambers, she must have sat in silence, her body weary, her spirit heavy. The cough still troubled her, her health fragile, yet she carried within her the knowledge that she was holding together more than her own life. She was steadying a monarch, and through him, a kingdom. This was the paradox of her existence: fragile lungs, delicate body, yet burdened with the weight of France. A woman mocked as frivolous, yet carrying responsibilities heavier than those who scorned her. The courtiers, of course, could not see this. They saw only the surface, the jewels, the gowns, the favor. They did not see the nights of council, the hours of listening, the exhaustion of bearing another's melancholy. They could not imagine that beneath the glitter lay weariness. that behind the smile lay sacrifice, and so they continued to mock, to whisper, to blame, even as she endured. Louis himself seemed scarcely aware of the burden he placed upon her. To him, her presence was natural, her counsel expected, her steadiness assumed. He did not question whether he asked too much. He accepted her support as one accepts the air one breathes without thought. Yet he cared for her still, valued her companionship, defended her against detractors. His devotion was real, if often quiet, and it sustained her through the hostility of others. And so the years passed, the king retreating into diversion, the mistress bearing the burden of influence. France drifted, scandals multiplied, wars faltered, yet Pompadour remained. She was not queen, not minister, yet she was the constant figure who steadied the man who bore the crown. In this constancy lay her power, and in this constancy lay her tragedy. The sound of hunting horns carried faintly across the palace grounds, the king once more absorbed in the thrill of chase. Within her chamber Pompadour listened, the echo of horns mingling with the silence of her solitude. She knew that when he returned, weary and distracted, he would seek her again, not for passion, not for statecraft, but for the comfort of her presence. And she, as always, would be there, steady, patient, enduring. The image remains unresolved, the horns fading into distance, the figure of a woman seated quietly, carrying upon her frail shoulders the weight of a kingdom that scarcely understood her. The hunting horns faded into distance, their echoes swallowed by the vast forests around Versailles. But within the palace another sound grew more insistent, the rasp of breath, the muffled cough behind closed doors, the slow decline of a woman who had given so much of her strength to the service of another. Madame de Pompadour, once radiant in youth and ambition, now faced her final years with the composure that had always been her truest crown. Illness, that quiet adversary which had shadowed her from the beginning, deepened its hold. Her lungs, fragile since girlhood, weakened further. Fevers came and went. Her body betrayed her with exhaustion even as her spirit sought to remain unbowed. Versailles, ever attentive to appearances, could not help but notice. Each pallor of her face, each absence from ceremony, each faint cough overheard in corridors became fodder for whispers. Courtiers speculated how long she might endure, whether her influence would at last dissolve into mortality. Some awaited her passing with impatience, eager to see her replaced, to reclaim power they believed stolen. Others, though fewer, regarded her with a measure of sorrow, for even adversaries could not deny that she had lived with dignity, that she had endured far longer than any had predicted. She herself seemed to meet her decline with quiet acceptance. At Bellevue, where the air was fresher and the gardens her solace, she spent long hours gazing upon the Seine, her breath shallow but steady, her eyes distant. She arranged flowers still, though her hands trembled. She listened to music, though often with eyes closed. She received friends, though fewer now, and with gentleness that seemed to grow as her strength diminished. The fragility of her body did not harden her heart. Instead, it softened her further, as though illness had stripped away all that was unnecessary, leaving only the core of patience and kindness. Louis XV continued to visit her, though his own fatigue deepened. Their companionship, once woven of passion, then of counsel, was now that of quiet loyalty. He sat beside her bed, listened as she spoke softly, reassured her with words less of ardor than of affection. To see her suffer stirred in him a tenderness he did not often show. He had been a king who retreated from burdens, who sought distraction in hunting and pleasures, yet with her he showed constancy. Perhaps he recognized that she had given him more than any other, that without her presence his reign would have faltered sooner, that she had been, in her way, his truest companion. Pompadour knew her time was drawing near. She spoke of it calmly, preparing not only herself but those around her. She arranged her affairs with the same composure she had arranged her salons, ensuring that her family would be provided for, that her servants would not be abandoned. She gave gifts, tokens of remembrance, as though scattering fragments of herself into the lives of those she left behind. Even in this, her focus was not on herself but on others. To the end, she shaped her image with dignity, determined that death should not find her disordered. The courtiers continued to whisper, yet death silences even envy. As her illness worsened, many who had mocked her grew quiet, unsettled by the sight of her fragility. For death, which strips away titles and jewels, reminded them that they too were mortal, that no favor could shield them from the same end. To see Pompadour, once the dazzling figure of Versailles, now pale and coughing, was to glimpse their own reflection in time's mirror. Perhaps this softened some of their disdain, perhaps not. But within her chamber, Pompadour cared little for their judgment. Her concern was only to endure with grace. Her faith, though often questioned by critics, deepened in these years. She received sacraments, prayed softly, sought reconciliation with the God who governs all destinies. To the clergy who had condemned her, she offered no bitterness, only humility. Some, surprised by her piety, spoke afterward of her sincerity. Perhaps she wished to meet death not as marquise or mistress, but simply as Jeanne-Antoinette, child of Paris, soul awaiting mercy. The scene of her final decline is quiet, tender, without drama. She lay upon her bed at Versailles in April of 1764, the palace hushed around her. Rain fell softly upon the courtyards, the sky gray, the air heavy with silence. The king visited her until the end, though he could not remain for the final hour. When at last she passed, she was only 42 years old. Too young, perhaps, for a life so filled with endurance, yet old in the weariness that years of scandal, influence, and solitude had carved into her. Louis XV, upon hearing of her death, is said to have looked from the windows of Versailles at the rain and murmured, "The marquise will not have good weather for her journey." A simple phrase, yet filled with the quiet grief of a man who had lost not only a mistress, but the companion of 2 decades. He attended her funeral, though kings seldom did so for mistresses, and in this gesture showed that his bond with her had been more than passion, more than convenience. It had been companionship, loyalty, affection that endured until death. And so she left the stage of Versailles, not with scandal, but with silence, not with grandeur, but with dignity. Her enemies breathed relief, her friends sorrow, the king melancholy. Yet even in death she remained presence, for her taste, her patronage, her very image lingered in the halls she had once walked. Portraits of her still hung upon the walls, porcelain still bore her influence, fashion still reflected her style. She was gone, yet she remained. The image endures, a bedchamber in twilight, curtains stirring faintly, rain pattering against the windows, and upon the bed a woman whose breath has ceased, yet whose presence lingers in the silence. The cough is gone, the frailty ended, but the dignity remains, as though death itself bowed before her composure. The rain fell softly against the windows of Versailles, steady and unrelenting, as though the heavens themselves mourned in silence. Within the palace, the corridors seemed unusually hushed. Servants moved with lowered eyes, courtiers spoke in muted tones, and even the rustle of silk appeared subdued. Madame de Pompadour was gone. The cough that had echoed faintly through her apartments had ceased forever, leaving behind a quiet emptiness that no music, no theater, no laughter could fill. Louis XV, so often accused of indifference, revealed in that moment the tenderness of a man who had lost his truest companion. He had known other women, many who had flared brightly and then faded, but none who had shared his burdens with such constancy. For 2 decades she had walked beside him, through passion and counsel, through scandal and war, through the solitude of monarchy that few could understand. And now, As he gazed upon the rain-streaked windows, he murmured words remembered ever since. The Marquise will not have good weather for her journey. Simple, almost casual, yet in their quietness lay a depth of grief he could scarcely admit aloud. He attended her funeral, an act unusual for a king. Monarchs were expected to maintain distance, to treat mistresses as diversions unworthy of solemn ceremony. Yet Louis defied this, walking among mourners, showing by his presence that Pompadour's place had not been mere indulgence, but necessity, not fleeting desire, but enduring companionship. Those who watched were struck by his solemnity, by the heaviness in his bearing. For a man so often aloof, his mourning revealed the truth of their bond more eloquently than words. The funeral itself was not one of great pomp, but of quiet dignity. Draped carriages carried her body through rain-slick streets, black cloth billowing in the wind. Few crowds gathered, for her name had long been tainted by scandal in the eyes of the people. Yet those who did watch felt a strange hush, as though they glimpsed not merely a mistress carried to rest, but a chapter of France itself closing. She was buried with respect, though not with the grandeur of royalty, and yet in her passing she remained the focus of whispered words, some pitying, some scornful, some wistful. For those who had known her intimately, grief was real. Artists remembered her patronage, musicians her kindness, petitioners her generosity. Servants who had been treated with gentleness mourned her sincerely. Friends who had gathered at Bellevue and Petit Trianon spoke of her loyalty, of her laughter even in sorrow. They saw in her not the caricature of pamphlets, but the woman who had offered a hand of compassion even when her own strength waned. For them, her absence was not only loss, but emptiness, a silence where once there had been presence. The courtiers, ever watchful of opportunity, could not conceal their relief. Many had resented her influence, envied her proximity to the king, feared her counsel. With her gone, they saw new chances for favor, new openings for intrigue. Yet even as they whispered of who might replace her, they recognized something that unsettled them. No one could truly take her place. Others might share the king's bed, others might amuse him, but none could replicate the years of companionship, the steadiness of presence, the intimacy of trust. In her absence, Louis XV seemed older, more weary, more withdrawn, as though, with her departure, some vital part of his spirit had slipped away. The kingdom itself scarcely paused in mourning. Wars continued, ministers argued, scandals shifted to new targets. Life in France moved onward, indifferent to the passing of one woman. Yet traces of her lingered everywhere, in the pinks and pastels of gowns, in the porcelain of Sèvres, in the lighter styles of furniture and architecture, in the very cadence of Versailles' entertainments. Even those who scorned her could not escape her influence, for she had woven herself into the fabric of the age. One wonders what Louis XV felt in the days after her death, when he returned to chambers now empty of her laughter, when he attended suppers without her gentle presence, when he rode to the hunt without her serene encouragement awaiting him. Did he feel guilt for the burdens he had placed upon her fragile shoulders? Did he remember her not as scandal, but as solace, not as ambition, but as friend? His words at the window suggest a sorrow deeper than he showed, a grief cloaked in understatement, but real nonetheless. For kings, who are seldom permitted to be men, grief must often be carried silently. Yet perhaps in the solitude of his private rooms, he allowed himself to mourn openly, to feel the absence not of a mistress, but of the one who had steadied him against the storms of his reign. The rain continued for days, as though the sky itself mirrored his melancholy. The courtyards of Versailles glistened with puddles, reflections of gray clouds shimmering upon their surfaces. Those who walked there spoke softly, as if unwilling to disturb the hush. In such weather, it seemed easy to believe that Pompadour's spirit lingered still, moving unseen through the halls, present in the echoes of laughter long since faded. Thus the story of her life closed not with scandal, but with sorrow, not with dismissal, but with devotion. She had been mistress, advisor, patron, tastemaker, companion. She had been loved and hated, admired and mocked, cherished and condemned. She had endured illness, ridicule, hostility, yet remained constant until the end. In her death, she revealed the truth of her life, that she had been, above all, indispensable to the man who wore the crown. The image remains unresolved. Black draped carriages rolling slowly through rain, wheels cutting through puddles, a king gazing silently from his window, and a woman carried away into the silence of memory, leaving behind a presence that could not be erased. The carriages rolled through the rain, their black draperies heavy with water, their wheels cutting grooves into the soft earth of the road, and with them passed not only a woman, but an era. The rain did not cease when Madame de Pompadour was laid to rest. It lingered, as though the sky itself insisted that her absence would be felt not in silence alone, but in the very air. Yet as the waters receded, as the earth dried and Versailles returned to its endless routine of ceremony and intrigue, her image did not vanish. Instead, it began a second life, woven into memory, reshaped in story, immortalized in both admiration and disdain. For Pompadour's legacy did not end in her coffin. It stretched onward in porcelain and portraits, in fashions and whispers, in the divided voices of those who could never agree on who she truly had been. Painters preserved her with brush and pigment, most notably François Boucher, who captured her in poses both languid and luminous. In these canvases, she is surrounded by books and flowers, not merely ornament, but symbol of her refinement, her intellect, her cultivation of beauty. Her eyes gaze outward serenely, her features softened, her gowns rich with folds of silk that seem almost alive. To look upon these portraits is to see not scandal, but serenity, not manipulation, but composure. Through art, she became eternal. Her presence carried far beyond Versailles to the salons and palaces of Europe, where admirers and critics alike studied her image. Porcelain bore her influence just as enduringly. The delicate creations of Sèvres, refined under her patronage, spread across the continent, gifts between monarchs, treasures in noble households. Each vase, each cup, each figurine carried something of her taste, a trace of her vision for elegance. Long after her death, collectors sought these pieces, prized not only for their craftsmanship, but for the association with the woman who had made them fashionable. Thus she lived on in objects, fragile yet lasting, echoes of her own paradox. Fashion, too, remembered her. The pink that bore her name, subtle and luminous, remained a shade admired long after the whispers of scandal had faded. Hairstyles imitating her arrangements endured, gowns cut in her favored forms continued to appear. Even as new queens and new mistresses rose, her style lingered, a reminder that taste can outlast power, that beauty can endure where authority dissolves. Yet memory was not only gentle. The pamphlets that had mocked her in life continued to shape her reputation in death. To some, she was remembered as manipulative, ambitious, the symbol of a monarchy corrupted by indulgence. She was blamed for wars she had not commanded, for extravagance she had not alone created, for decline she could not have prevented. In this way she became scapegoat even beyond the grave, a convenient vessel for anger at a monarchy drifting toward its eventual collapse. The revolution that would come decades later would look back upon her as emblem of the excess it sought to destroy. And still, others remembered her with affection. To the artists she had supported, she was patroness and protector. To friends she had sheltered, she was a loyal companion. To the king, even in memory, she was the one who had steadied him, who had shared his solitude, who had borne his melancholy with patience. These remembrances softened the harsher portraits, reminding history that she had been more than caricature, more than scandal, more than symbol. What then is her true legacy? Was she manipulator or muse, ornament or advisor, frivolous or profound? The truth lies not in a single portrait, but in the tension between them all. She was each of these things and more: a child of prophecy, a woman of wit, a mistress of a king, a patron of beauty, a bearer of solitude, a figure both adored and despised. Her life was not simple, nor her legacy clear, and perhaps that is fitting, for lives lived under the weight of destiny seldom resolve into clarity. In the quiet of evening, when one looks upon her portraits or holds a fragment of porcelain she once cherished, one may sense the ambiguity that defined her. Was she content or lonely? Was she powerful or merely proximate to power? Did she believe in her destiny, or simply live it because others believed it for her? These questions linger like echoes in an empty hall, never answered, never silenced. Yet there is one certainty: she mattered. She shaped her time not through armies or decrees, but through presence, taste, and endurance. She revealed that influence need not roar, it may whisper. That power need not command, it may console. That beauty, even mocked, may outlast bitterness. Her life was scandalous, yes, but scandal is only one layer, and beneath it lies a story of resilience, of tenderness, of survival in a world that sought constantly to undo her. And so, dear listener, as we let this story drift into silence, imagine her once more, seated at her desk, a candle flickering low, a letter folded and left unopened, porcelain glimmering softly nearby, flowers releasing their scent into the night air. Outside, rain begins to fall, gentle and steady, carrying her spirit onward, as though she is still traveling on a journey without end. And now I leave you with this quiet thought: was she the woman who ruled a king, or the woman who simply steadied a man too weary for his crown? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps she was more. As you rest, let her story remain with you like a fading candle flame, uncertain yet luminous, scandalous yet serene.